Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
Hello, everyone. This is Cal Raustiala, co-host of International Law Behind the Headlines, and I'm very happy to have on the podcast for this session Richard Gowan. Richard is UN Director at the International Crisis Group, sometimes referred to just as Crisis Group. And Richard is a longtime UN watcher and really one of the people in Turtle Bay who knows the most about what is happening in the building and around the building and generally in the UN system. So I've invited Richard on as part of our general series about the Trump administration and international law. We are recording this on Friday, January 31st. So it is before the arrival of Elise Stefanik, the new U.S. permanent representative or UN ambassador. But she's likely to arrive pretty soon. And maybe by the time this is actually on the air, she will have arrived. So Richard, welcome to the podcast and thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think in light of the fact that we're sort of recording this and conversing before her arrival, but in the opening weeks of the Trump administration, it might be helpful to just get a kind of level set on where the UN stands today in your estimation. In other words, how would you sort of assess the organization's relevance, significance, kind of level of dysfunction, chaos, effectiveness, however you want to put it? It's come under quite a bit of scrutiny, and I would say, maybe more than a usual amount of criticism in recent years. But it continues to be quite central. So I would just be curious in your general assessment, kind of without taking into account the Trump effect, and then we'll turn to some of the Trump issues.
Well, I think it is fair to say that the UN is at a post-Cold War low point right at the moment in terms of both cooperation amongst its members and also in terms of what it's delivering globally. Obviously, we are now nearly at the third anniversary of Russia's all-out aggression against Ukraine. Ever since the Russian attack on Kiev, politics in the Security Council has been becoming more and more toxic. The war in Gaza has probably been even more painful diplomatically than the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I think if you talk to any diplomat, any UN official, they will tell you that the Security Council is failing. And of course, we should remember that the Council has failed before. Many times it failed over Bosnia, it failed over Rwanda. But it does seem to be at a particularly acute moment of dysfunction. And then if you look beyond the Council, the UN is not really hitting it out of the park on other files. Progress on the Sustainable Development Goals is awfully slow. We're actually seeing poverty increasing in some regions, despite UN pledges to end poverty. And climate diplomacy is also very obviously going off the rails with global warming passing the levels that countries had pledged to keep it at just 10 years ago in Paris. Mm-hmm. And so if you ask a diplomat here, you will often find that they say that they're really struggling to explain to their capitals what the value of the institution is now and what on earth we can do to make it better.
Yeah, that is a very, I think it's an apt assessment. It's a difficult one, obviously, to take in, because this is a time where so much is needed from the organization, but I can't really disagree with your take. So I guess in light of that, let's maybe start with what we might reasonably expect from the Trump administration when Stefanik arrives. Her background doesn't suggest enormous familiarity with a lot of the issues around the UN, but she's a smart person. And also, of course, we have had a Trump administration before. And so we might be able to draw some lessons from that. So I guess with regard to Security Council affairs, which I think will occupy quite a bit of their attention, at least initially, what sorts of things do you think we might expect in the coming weeks and months?
Well, actually, Cal, I think even before we get to Stefanik, we should recognize that Trump has already, in his first 2 weeks in office, taken some significant, though quite predictable, swipes at the UN.
Excellent. Yes, please.
The Paris Climate Change Agreement on day one. He pulled out of the World Health Organization on day one, or at least he said that the US would pull out. And the administration's 90-day freeze on aid funding is hitting a lot of UN agencies really hard. I mean, we hear from UN officials that they're sitting with, American funds in their bank accounts, and they just don't know whether they can disperse the money they've already received from Washington. And this is hitting everything from assistance to refugees to demining programs. So, Trump is having an effect on the UN even before Ambassador Stefanik arrives in town. It's fair to say that people like the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, did know this was coming. Guterres actually asked his financial advisors last year to work through budget projections on how the UN could operate without any US funding at all. Some of the UN agencies that knew they would be in the firing line have also been doing quite a lot of calculations about how to survive without American support. But nonetheless, the US is such a huge funder of UN efforts that this is going to be a very, very bumpy time. And that's even before Stefanik arrives and starts to shake up things politically.
Yeah. Thank you for raising all of that. Those are really important points. I mean, of course, there's a history of the United States not contributing in full, being in arrears, sometimes in very large numbers. Much of that was worked out in the past, and it's ebbed and flowed. But this could be an order. I don't know if an order of magnitude difference, but certainly an even worse situation financially. So that's quite interesting that that kind of planning is already taking place. And of course, your points about the kind of shock and awe effect of many of his moves, some of which I think no one was surprised by, pulling out of certain specialized agencies that he's never liked and disparaged. But the sweeping nature of the funding issue was, I think surprising to some people. And that will have huge effects.
I mean, it's worth saying that in her confirmation hearing, Elise Stefanik did offer some glimmers of hope. She identified some UN agencies that she likes, like the World Food Programme and UNICEF, both of which traditionally have US leaders and get a lot of US funding. So I think if you're sitting in Rome at the World Food Programme, you're probably crossing your fingers and thinking that, this is a bit of turbulence and you'll come through it. If by contrast, you're sitting, for example, at the headquarters of UN Women, which Republicans criticized a huge amount for its response to the 7th of October attacks by Hamas in Israel, I think you're very nervous indeed, because you do wonder if you're going to be the target for extended financial retribution from the US.
Yeah, agreed. And then, of course, there's also some crises developing or metastasizing as we speak. I'm thinking specifically of Eastern Congo, longstanding set of issues there. But it's not clear what the U.S. position is going to be as those things evolve. And there's, I suppose, a sense already that there's a bit of a vacuum in terms of U.S. focus, whether there's a full complement in the U.S. UN mission or not. It's not really clear what the U.S. is going to do. So yeah, I think a lot here to cover. So I think those are all really important points. Do you expect, or do you think it's possible that there will be further dramatic either cuts or withdrawals from other UN agencies, or you mentioned the Paris Agreement, of course, other treaties or quasi-treaties like that, or anything else that we might see coming down the pike?
I mean, Trump has moved so fast that sometimes I feel like I need to double check whether he's pulled out of certain UN agencies or not.
Yeah.
One area where we're expecting the administration to be very disruptive is around migration. And the first Trump administration really tried to undermine efforts to improve UN-led cooperation on migration. And that was something which was very specifically a concern for Stephen Miller. And Stephen Miller, as you know, is a sort of Trump super loyalist who is now, I think, one of the deputy chiefs of staff in the White House. So I think we can see there are other areas where, the US is likely to be causing more disruption in the months ahead. I mean, there had been concerns, just staying on financial issues for a moment, that the president would announce that the US was going to cut off funding for the UN altogether. But I don't think that is where we're going to end up. Stefanik's messaging has been that she wants to see the UN look for efficiencies. She wants the UN to use US taxpayer dollars more responsibly, but she's still talking in terms of the US providing financial support for the UN. However, what I'm finding at the moment is that a lot of diplomats from other countries waiting for Stefanik, hoping to make a positive impression on Stefanik, are doing back of the envelope calculations about what reform ideas, what cost savings they could propose to try and start on a good footing with the US. So I think that this year we're going to be hearing a lot about financial savings cuts, the need to shrink bits of the UN bureaucracy, and that's going to be an ongoing narrative.
Yeah, no doubt. And some of that is traditional Republican approach to the UN. But of course, Trump has his own kind of unusual spin on that. I'm not, I guess, surprised, much like it sounds like within the building, the reaction is much like outside the building, where many people are, in essence, trying to figure out how best to both anticipate and sort of kiss the ring to ensure that whatever they want is protected. What's been the reaction that you're hearing, maybe informally in the corridors, about the election of Trump? In other words, how do you see the Russians reacting, the Chinese? Sometimes there's some interesting reactions we hear about overseas where people seem surprisingly happy, or at least in some cases more optimistic than I would have expected. Is there anything really surprising that you hear from other member states?
Well, it's worth saying that I think UN members' views of Trump's return were quite colored by dissatisfaction with the Biden administration's positioning in the Security Council on Gaza. And, Biden and his ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, actually did a lot of good work in 2021, 2022, rebuilding US-UN ties after Trump 1.0. I think Linda Thomas-Greenfield actually did a really good job also rallying UN members to condemn Russia in 2022 over the aggression against Ukraine. But sadly, a lot of that constructive diplomatic work, constructive coalition building really got, undercut 100%, because the vast majority of UN members were unhappy that the US would not support calls in the Security Council or the General Assembly for a ceasefire in Gaza. And so, by last November, there were quite a lot of diplomats saying, does it really make a difference? Isn't it true that all US administrations are dismissive of the UN in the end? And I actually think that was somewhat unfair, because it overlooked what the US tried to do during Biden's term positively at the UN, but it certainly did affect how Trump's arrival was seen. Now, talking to different groups of diplomats around the UN, as I say, there are some who actually really think that they can work with Stefanik on reducing UN costs and making the UN more efficient. And that's something we're hearing quite a lot from some of the bigger donor countries, because a lot of European countries in particular, actually think that the UN has got too expensive, and they do want to cut their own contributions. So that is
Right.
somewhere where they want to work with the US.
And they have rising defense expenses that they're being pressured or feel they must undertake.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They need to spend money on tanks, not on sustainable development.
Right.
But it's also true. I've heard this from African colleagues. They say, well, Trump is transactional. Maybe we can do business with him. I think there are quite a lot of countries that think that when you have Trump in office, you're going to face less sort of irritating criticisms of your human rights record. So I think everyone is trying to see if there is an opportunity. The Chinese, though, the Chinese, I think, are in a very difficult position. They remember Trump's first term as a pretty bleak time. Trump used the UN in 2020 as a platform to really bash Beijing over the COVID pandemic. And I think Chinese diplomats, judging from what I'm hearing, sort of worry that they're going to enter another very difficult period of sort of very public arguments with the US in New York. And so they do seem more nervous than most, which is ironic because there's lots of press coverage saying, well, when Trump leaves a UN agency like the WHO, it's an opportunity for China. China can step up and lead at the UN and replace the US. I'm not quite sure that's how the Chinese see it. I think they think this is going to be a difficult period for them.
I mean, that's an interesting assessment because it is the case that China is so much more active today within the UN than it was, even a decade ago, but certainly 2 decades ago. Let's say under the, George W. Bush administration, China's contributions, obviously financial contributions, are way up. So I suppose it stands to gain from some of these changes that are maybe underway financially. But yeah, I do think you're right that there's a common perception that I think accurate perception that China is playing a bigger role, and U.S. withdrawal necessarily creates space. So I'm struck by what you're saying. Do you think that Chinese are right to think that way, or what's driving? Why are they not seeing an opportunity in your assessment? How do you read that?
Well, so firstly, it's absolutely right to say that China's role at the UN has expanded beyond recognition in the last decade. I mean, I've been based in New York watching the UN since 2005, and I would say for my first decade here, up until about 2014 or 2015, China's positions hardly ever featured, except on very specific questions, perhaps where Taiwan was related. Since 2015, China's influence and questions about China's influence have become pervasive. And China, does have a lot more leverage around the UN than it used to. But what's always been interesting is that, as China's influence has grown, it's become clear that, the Chinese are still a little cautious about using that influence. They don't actually like spending very large amounts of money around the UN, for example. Mm-hmm. They're very cost conscious now when it comes to discussing things like the budgets for peacekeeping operations. And when you look at some of the big humanitarian initiatives, actually China hardly invests in them at all. We were talking about the World Food Programme. The US gave WFP over $4 billion last year. China gave WFP just over $10 million, slightly less Burundi gave it.
Amazing.
The Chinese don't actually seem to want to invest a lot financially in managing multilateral institutions in the way that the US traditionally has. And I think they're also nervous about the fact that the Trump administration is probably going to be very, very difficult and on the lookout for China trying to sort of put its nationals in top jobs around the UN system. The first Trump administration didn't really focus on that, and China was able to get some big jobs in the UN system while the US was looking the other way.
Yeah,
but I
very much.
This time around, it's not going to be so easy. And Stefanik has said she will be aiming to stop China getting more significant positions in the UN. So there's just going to be a lot of friction.
Yeah, and just for listeners who may not be aware, there's a sort of regular UN budget, of which China is a very large contributor under its assessment, but also a peacekeeping budget, which is separate and can be equally large. And so there's quite a number of different ways to spend money within the system and be assessed for that. So yeah, those are interesting points. And I think China, for all of its attention to the UN in recent years, it does seem cautious. I'll note even in its vetoes, I think all of the recent vetoes have been in conjunction with Russia. I don't think China's had a solo veto in decades, which is interesting itself. Maybe that's a good pivot to Security Council matters and some of the kind of continuing emergencies around the world and conflicts and so forth. What do you anticipate happening? You talked about Israel and Gaza. I think most people imagine that Stefanik was chosen to some degree because she's seen as a staunch supporter of Israel. But sometimes the Trump administration can be surprising. So what do you see happening on that front and Ukraine, Sudan? You can pick your crisis. You know them all. Is there anything surprising that we might expect or that you think might happen?
Well, so the one area where Stefanik has made her agenda very clear in advance is the Middle East. I mean, she is clearly going to double down on the previous administration's support for Israel at the UN, and whereas the Biden team were sensitive to pressure in the General Assembly, and did at least countenance Security Council resolutions on humanitarian aid to Gaza, I really doubt that Stefanik is going to even make those concessions. I mean, I think this is going to be very tough, very hardline defense of Israel, with very few caveats. One of her first priorities is likely going to be backing up Israel's ongoing effort to close down UNRWA, the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and Gaza. That shutdown process is already underway, right, and is going to run into a lot of criticism, especially from European allies. But Stefanik is just going to back up Israel on that 100%, arguing that UNRWA was complicit with Hamas on the 7th of October. I think there is also a very strong fear, and I know that Antonio Guterres has voiced this, that Israel's next move will be to announce that it is formally annexing, at least significant parts of the West Bank. And, obviously, I think every member of the Security Council would reject Israel's annexation claim, but Stefanik would use the US veto to halt that criticism. And so I think we can predict with a very high degree of certainty that there will be some more big arguments around Israel and the Palestinians pretty soon. I think it's also fairly clear that the US is going to aim to reimpose nuclear sanctions on Iran that were suspended as part of the 2015 nuclear deal. And actually, that's an area where the US may find that the Europeans are more helpful. And I think that in a lot of European capitals, there is a sense that it's time to put a bit more economic pressure on Iran, given the state of its nuclear program. But China and Russia will not easily accept that. So again, that's going to be a flashpoint for a lot of arguments. Once you get outside the Middle East, it all gets a bit more mysterious. Linda Thomas-Greenfield spent a lot of last year attempting to focus Security Council attention on Sudan. The Council passed 2 resolutions, calling for halts to hostilities in Sudan last year. Russia vetoed a third. there's just no indication that the incoming administration views the war in Sudan as an early priority.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, Thomas Greenfield and her team spent their last months in office really pushing for the UN to start getting ready to send a Blue Helmet peacekeeping force into Haiti. And that's something which the next this current administration might pick up, but we have no real indication on that either. If you listened to or read the transcript of Stefanik's confirmation hearing, the world beyond the Middle East and beyond China hardly existed. No one was asking about these cases. So I think that there is a lot, there's a lot of uncertainty. What I would say from experience is that I think at least every Republican ambassador to the UN comes thinking that they're going to major on the Middle East, that they're going to make their name by defending Israel. But over time, ambassadors often come to realize that they've actually got a lot more freedom of maneuver when it comes to dealing with situations in Africa or somewhere like Haiti, which isn't quite the same level of strategic significance. And so it may be that after some early high-profile moves on Israel and the Palestinians, Stefanik, who clearly is very canny and clearly does have a good grasp of the system she's coming into, maybe she will start to look at some of these second-order crises and see if she can actually make a more positive impact on those. And certainly her team, just to finish, have been, they've been saying in Washington that she doesn't just want to be seen as a pro-Israel person. She wants to be seen as someone with broader foreign policy vision and capabilities. She's proving herself in foreign policy for the first time. And she does actually apparently want to see if she can build collegial relations with other countries around issues, outside the Middle East. So, she may come in with a lot of sound and fury, but then after a bit start to look for areas where she can make more impact.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute take. And, one of the things that I believe about certainly any P5 member, permanent member, is you can only get things done, in a sense, through cooperation. You obviously, the veto is something that people fixate on, but you need to actually have a proactive agenda as well. And if you're constantly entangled and simply wielding vetoes reciprocally, nothing gets done, and that, in a sense, weakens what's an incredible power and privilege. So I think I think whatever her mindset, and I totally grant your assessment of that. I think as a sort of practical matter, that is how the members tend to see it over time. The governments have traditionally tended to see it. And there's a lot that goes on that doesn't necessarily make the front page, but is quite important. You raised a really interesting example with Haiti, where, of course, there's a very checkered history of UN peacekeepers there. But, it's exactly the sort of situation where it's close enough to the United States. It's a potential humanitarian, but also migration challenge that, Trump may well see this as something where, the UN is helpful and may come to learn the utility of the organization in these situations. If I might just follow up with one other example, which you didn't mention just now, but we talked about a little bit before, which is just what's happening between Rwanda and Congo. Any expectations there, or what's your read of that situation, which seems to be emerging in kind of a new way as we speak?
Well, and this is one of these unexpected events that can start to dominate a U.S. ambassador's time, even if it's not what she wanted.
Very much.
You have a conflict between rebels in the Eastern Congo backed by Rwanda and the Congolese armed forces, but this is also now drawn in South Africa, and with South African peacekeepers being killed, South Africa making some pretty stern, pretty bellicose warnings to Rwanda about the risks of escalation. And you don't have anyone in the White House, I think, yet who is, focusing on this. So it may fall to to Stefanik to see if she can broker some sort of ceasefire at least. Now, I've already been hearing speculation around the UN about what the terms for that ceasefire might be. People are saying, well, Israel is close to Rwanda. Maybe the US is going to favor the Rwandan side. I'm not sure about the ins and outs of the likely diplomacy, but this could be something that lands on Stefanik's desk on day one, even if she would rather be talking about the West Bank on day one. And there's a really interesting comparison here with Nikki Haley, because Nikki Haley, Trump's first ambassador to the UN, also arrived in New York in 2017, very much talking about the Middle East, very much focused on the Iran deal, which the US was still a participant of at that time. But in the course of 2017, we had the Iranian nuclear crisis. And by the end of the year, Haley was negotiating with the Chinese on a series of sanctions packages against North Korea aimed on containing that crisis. And actually, Antonio Guterres and his staff also became involved in a bit of shuttle diplomacy on behalf of the Americans with the North Koreans. And, by the time Haley left, she had made lots of strong points about Israel's interests, but actually most diplomats would have said that her biggest contribution at the UN had been helping to manage the North Korean nuclear crisis. And so maybe it's Congo, or maybe Kim Jong-un will decide he wants to grab some attention by setting off another nuclear weapon, and that will drag in Stefanik too. The key point is that the US doesn't always get to decide the agenda at the UN. The agenda is forced upon it, and that does seem to be what we're seeing this year, just as we saw it in 2017.
Yeah, fascinating take. Well, Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. There's obviously a ton we didn't get to, and a lot that's going to unfold, as you just I think rightly said. This is true in foreign policy generally, but I think especially so within the building. So I hope that we might be able to revisit this conversation, in 6 months or a year or something. If we can get you back on the podcast, I very much hope that you'll agree to come back on and continue the conversation. So thank you again for joining us today and for your insights.
Thank you very much indeed.